Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those in Europe. Welcome to our webinar called Life Beyond Brexit, if anyone in such a thing, to discuss how negotiations are faring over the rights for UK citizens in the European Union. My name is Elizabeth Collett. I am the Director of Migration Policy Institute Europe, which is an independent think tank dedicated to the study of migration worldwide and particularly within the European Union. A fantastic lineup of presenters for discussion this afternoon. We have from the European Commission, from the Financial Times, from MPI itself, and from the European Citizen Action Service, and I will introduce them in a second. But first, a quick housekeeping note. The audio from this webinar will be on our website later today at migrationpolicy.org/events. And if you're experiencing any technical problems right now, email events@migrationpolicy.org. And if you have problems hearing via the web, please dial in using the call-in information that was sent to you earlier via email. We will be having today a written rather than voice question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please type in any questions into the Q&A chat box you see on the right side of your screen, or you can email events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss, and we will pick those up. The focus of our discussion in part today is on a paper that MPI released this morning called Safe or Sorry? Prospects for Britons in the European Union After Brexit, which is now available on our website. And the real goal of this paper is to profile the UK population living elsewhere in the EU and the likely challenges that that UK population may face after Brexit.
To finish the thought, which is that, as Liz said, we're releasing a paper today which profiles the UK population and looks at what could happen to various groups under either a deal between the EU and the UK on the issue of citizens' rights, and also what may happen if there's no deal on issues such as access to the labour market, social security, and the key issue of regularising status. And the motivation behind this issue, behind this project, initially was really that we felt that the question of UK nationals in the EU was being seen as a kind of a B topic, a for discussion later topic. And I think it's quite clear this year that that has definitely changed. It's been extremely high profile. And that's partly because it's been tied to the question of EU nationals in the UK, which is the other half of the sort of citizens' rights problem. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start by taking stock of the progress on negotiations on the question of citizens' rights in the first half of the speakers' interventions, and then in the second half look more closely at the specific issue of the UK population in the EU and the specific issues that they raise. So I'm very pleased to start by introducing Marie Simonson. Marie is in Michel Barnier's cabinet, and so she's been responsible for the citizens' rights issues and has been really in the thick of the negotiations. She's going to talk a little bit about some of the how the negotiations are faring and some of the main sticking points over this issue. Marie.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to this webinar. So I'm leading the negotiations on citizens' rights, and I'm going to explain to you the state of play of the negotiations on citizens' rights, our starting point, just to explain a little bit about our position and the reasons for our position, and then the global picture after the 5 rounds that we had so far. So on the basis of the European Council mandate, we published a document called Essential Principles on Citizens' Rights in mid-June, and this is our negotiating position. It covers both EU citizens in the UK and UK nationals in the EU 27. In short, we want to protect the rights based on current life choices of EU citizens residing or working in the UK at the time of withdrawal, and likewise for UK nationals in EU27. So this includes the right to reside, to work, to study, to be joined by family members, just like it is set out in EU law today. So since under Article 50 of the treaty, we are in the process of disentanglement and not further integration, we limit the rights to those based on current life choices, as I just said, and not hypothetical future choices. As you may know, the first round was held on the 19th of June. It was quite delayed by the UK's general election. We discussed the planning of the negotiations on citizens. We didn't have the UK's position yet. Then, a couple of weeks later, the UK published its position paper on citizens. And then, due to the fact that both sides had set out their positions, we could immediately, at the second round, clarify our positions in order to identify convergence and divergence. And this is reflected in this color-coded joint EU-UK technical note that we publish after each round. You may have seen it on our website. And then we had rounds in July, August, September, October, and we will have the next round here on Thursday and Friday this week. It was quite clear already from the second round that the main divergences concern the role of the Court of Justice of the European Union, the direct effect of the withdrawal agreement, so the possibility for citizens to enforce their rights directly on the basis of the agreement, family reunion, the right to export social security benefits after withdrawal. And then we had a general disagreement on the very scope of the withdrawal agreement in distinguishing between persons who already exercised free movement rights compared to future border crossing, and with respect to the right to provide cross-border services and to secondary establishment. And these main divergences have still not been solved. So we made a lot of progress simply by clarifying our respective positions. We did clarify, as you can also see from this color-coded table, that we are basing the rights on EU law concepts in the withdrawal agreement that should be interpreted in line with the case law of the Court of Justice at the point, as it was at the point of the UK's withdrawal. On the personal scope, we're talking about the persons who resided lawfully in the UK or EU27 in accordance with the Free Movement Directive and in accordance with Article 21 of the treaty. We're also including frontier workers, for example. The eligibility criteria for both temporary and permanent resident status should be exactly the same as those set out in the Free Movement Directive, and there should be no further discretion to refuse applicants. And then we want to protect, both sides want to protect the right of workers, self-employed students, economically inactive citizens, just like today under EU law. Finally, on social security coordination rules, we agreed that we want to maintain more or less the same system as today, including, for example, the healthcare system, but the UK does not accept to export other benefits than old age pensions after withdrawal. So the remaining issues of divergence are the following. The UK wants to introduce this new UK settled status process that would be the only path of proving lawful residence. And this is clearly different from the system provided for in the Free Movement Directive, where you can provide your evidence for your rights with other means than just one residence document. We disagree on the rules on family reunion. We want to apply current rules. The UK will apply UK immigration law that is way more restrictive. As I mentioned before, the role of the Court of Justice and the direct effect on these points we need much more precision and precise commitments from the UK side until we can talk about an agreement. On the export of social security benefits post-exit, as I said, we want to apply the current rules for all exportable benefits today, whereas the UK want to exclude, for example, invalidity benefits, sickness benefits, other income replacing benefits from the scope. Then we have a disagreement that is particularly interesting for UK nationals in the EU on the further free movement rights. As under the Free Movement Directive today, the free movement rights concern the movement from a member state A to a member state B. If you move onwards after that, it's a new right that you create and a new process. Now, the UK sees the whole of the EU27 as one territory. So in their view, a UK national today residing in Germany should have the right to move around in the future in all 27 EU member states. And here, of course, we find this proposal a little bit unbalanced compared to the rights that would be given to EU citizens in the UK. Then we have disagreement on criminality committed post-exit. The UK wants to apply UK immigration law that implies automatic expulsion if you have a prison sentence of minimum 12 months. Under our directive today, you need to carry out an individual assessment before deporting a person. We need to clarify the cutoff date. The UK has not told us and confirmed what they actually want here. So we need more clarification on the administrative procedures. They have to be smooth and simple compared to the cumbersome 85 pages story that we have today. The UK will publish a note probably today where they specify in detail how they will ensure these smooth and simple administrative procedures. And that note could be really helpful for reaching an agreement, or at least to clarify the situation. We need more clarification on the procedural safeguards and judicial redress, as set out in the Free Movement Directive. And the UK will clarify this, I think, on Thursday as well. And then we have to have some further discussions on the professional qualifications from our side, how people can prepare for their future status as third country nationals with respect to professional qualifications. So the next rounds will aim at solving as many of those issues as possible. So thank you very much. I'll stop here and hand over to Liz.
Yes, I am back, and I'm very sorry for losing the connection earlier. Thank you, Marie. That was incredibly helpful in terms of setting out very clearly where the lines of division are and some of the future challenges that may be emerging. If I can now then turn to Alex Barker, who is the Brussels Bureau Chief of the Financial Times and quick becoming the preeminent Brexit watcher in both Brussels and the UK, to offer us, your political insights on how the negotiations are going, the deal or no deal question, and particularly implications then for UK citizens abroad.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and especially for the generous introduction. I guess, if you stand back from this, it is clearly hugely frustrating for those caught up in the kind of uncertainty around this and their status. But on a political level, if you look at this point, it could have been much worse. The politics has actually proved a bit easier than some expected around the citizen rights issues. And as Marie was outlining, there's actually been quite a lot of progress on a lot of areas simply by clarifying where the two countries were. Now, I think one of the reasons for that is that we've seen the referendum, the election, since those kind of moments, there have been shifting political red lines in the UK, and a lot of the old worries that you would have thought would have really roiled up these talks, such as, sovereignty issues, child benefit exports, the potential for a surge of migration to the UK, which some in the UK worried about, those have actually fallen into the background a bit more as the kind of scale of the challenge of Brexit has become clearer. The importance for those supporters of Brexit of the kind of future arrangements, particularly around migration, are more important in some ways than kind of restrictions on the past and those who are already in the UK. And I think that has generally provided a context that's made this discussion a bit easier. Now, so why the wait? What's holding it all up? Well, I mean, the first point is that this is caught up to some degree in the kind of meta-politics of the negotiation, that moving forward in elements of the citizen rights negotiation is a chip that's played against other parts, either money or Ireland. You want to play your hand, if you were the UK, at the right moment to ensure that you maintain the momentum when you need it, and try to kind of work through to this second phase. And I think there was a moment before the October summit where it looked possible that a deal on citizen rights would kind of come together and gel, and the UK side held back, mainly for these kind of tactical reasons. It's also going to take longer, even once the politics kind of gels, to actually, set this on paper and run through the detail. And Marie is going to have many months of drafting all this and working through the more technical elements. And for the 3 million, that is going to mean quite a protracted period of uncertainty, not least because whatever is agreed on citizens does depend on an overall deal coming together at the end of 2018 that will mean an exit agreement and everything else that the UK and the EU may require to come alongside that. Now, next week, there's a bit more optimism that you make some progress on the citizen rights front, and these are as much journalistic hunches and conversations around with some of the people involved, but you can see a bit of movement maybe from the EU on the kind of direct jurisdiction of the ECJ over some of this. I think the direct effect provisions that the UK are willing to take on board, if those are precise enough, I think you could see movement on the ECJ from the EU side. The criminal checks, I can't imagine the 27 really holding this up as something to hold up the whole negotiation over. And similarly on family rights, I suspect there might be room for a compromise there around that fits a bit more the kind of UK approach of ensuring that UK nationals and EU nationals in the UK have the same level of family rights. On the UK side, I think the cut-off date is clearly going to be 2019 or even 2021, I guess, if you're thinking about a transition. I think there's going to have to be much more clarity and a more relaxed regime on the kind of registration processes and potentially on the exportability of benefits as well. Marie was talking about the issue of further free movement within the 27, and on the UK side, there's the question of when an EU national living in the UK who leaves, when they would lose their rights, and you again see potentially a deal around that, but Marie might tell me I'm completely wrong, which leaves the kind of really hard nitty-gritty, which is actually going to be the kind of lived experience for most people, which is around the administration of this. And it's going to be heavy on bureaucracy, even when the plan is to make it as light as possible. This really gets quite complicated at the level at which it will be implemented, and that is really going to be tremendously important. And there might also be gaps that people may not quite realize yet. Posted workers, for instance, it sounds like posted workers will be outside of this agreement. There are, 30, 40,000, I think, in the UK, and or potentially more. I'm not even sure how many British posted workers there are in the EU at the moment, but I'm sure many of them don't realize that they would be outside of this agreement as it stands. And of course, there's the no-deal situation, and if the negotiations do become more acrimonious and it becomes more testy and difficult over coming months, then that no-deal scenario is going to become much more a real possibility for individuals. And I think on the sides of the EU side and the UK side, you'll probably need some clarity from them about the kind of arrangements that would be in place if that they would put in place unilaterally if there was no deal, and I think a lot of that would actually look much like the kind of substance of the arrangements that they're discussing at the moment, without the kind of oversight that you'd have through a deal and the kind of direct effect and things like that. But I'll leave it there and let Megan tell you much more about the kind of challenges of implementation in particular.
Thanks, Alex, and I thank you particularly for bringing up the bureaucracy and administration issue, because I think we're all talking about the principles still, not just for the UK, which will have a huge administrative burden in the future, but for other EU member states, this is going to be a challenge if they seek to decide what status and how to affect the status of, in some cases, quite sizable numbers of UK nationals. And to give us more detail on that, I'd like to introduce Megan Benton, who is the Senior Policy Analyst and Assistant Director for Research for the International Programme at MPI, and the author of the paper, who's going to give us a little more detail on who the UK population is and some of the challenges that we may be potentially looking at, even if there is a deal on the rights of EU citizens and things to keep an eye on. Megan.
Thanks very much, Liz, and thanks very much for the plug of my paper. There's a lot in that paper, and I'm not going to try to summarize it all, so I'd strongly advise people at home just to sort of skim through it while I'm speaking, use the two different halves of your brain in different ways, whatever you want. Instead, I'm just going to pull out, I think, 3 points. The first is about the difficulties of diagnosing the problem when it comes to the issue of UK nationals in the EU. And the second is about the diversity of the population. And then the third is about the nature of a deal and whether we're placing too much stock on the idea that a deal will be the end, the sort of end state, and it will solve all the potential problems that Brits might face in the EU after Brexit. So when I say it's difficult to diagnose the problem, I'm not just referring to the sort of headache that this paper caused me. What I mean is that the data on the UK population in the EU is really patchy and somewhat unreliable. So we talk all the time about this figure of 1.2 million UK-born or 900,000 UK citizens who live elsewhere in the EU, but we think that this underestimates the sort of true scale of the UK population who lives and sort of has lives embedded somewhere else in the EU. The problem is that these data rely on registration data and surveys of permanent migration, which is quite different to some of the characteristics of free movement in the EU, which is that people move sometimes on a seasonal basis, they maintain houses in 2 different countries, etc. The data also doesn't tell us who might have the opportunity to stay through other routes if there isn't a deal, for instance, because they're married to a national or they're entitled to permanent residence or citizenship. So we just really have snapshots of what's going on in different countries rather than the kind of reliable comparative data that one might hope. So, for instance, we know that 3/4 of UK nationals in Germany have been in the country for 5 years or more. Our analysis suggests it's 80% in Spain, which means that the permanent population, at least, is a sort of settled population, which gives them a sort of initial right to stay. The second issue is the sort of the diversity of the population, which also really complicates predictions about who's going to be vulnerable and who will be able to stay if there's no deal. I think it also makes it harder to design a deal that works for everyone. It becomes that much more complicated. So the media often focuses on this stereotype of Brits retiring in the sun on the Costa Brava, but what our paper shows is that the Brits in the EU are a really diverse group. They include high-skilled workers, business owners, students, children. So, for instance, more than a third of Brits are over 65 in Spain and Cyprus, but the picture is very different elsewhere. It's only less than 10% in the Netherlands, for instance. And their economic status also differs dramatically, which will make a huge difference to their prospects after Brexit. So in the Netherlands, more than half of British workers earn more than €3,000 a month, and 40% earn more than €4,000, which makes them the highest among the highest paid foreign workers in the country. This is quite different in Spain, where less than half of Brits who registered in the last few years said they were in work or self-employed. And as I said, this diversity makes a difference to the deal. It also makes a difference to how the deal is implemented and which groups might struggle at that stage. So Alex talked a bit about how the next phase will be heavy on bureaucracy. Well, I think we really need to see any deal as just the start of a process that's going to be quite messy and complicated and potentially leave lots of people falling through the gaps or even floating in a kind of legal limbo. So these are people who might have moved backwards and forwards on a seasonal basis. Perhaps they maintain a home in the UK and abroad. They didn't register with their local municipality. They've moved around for work. They don't have continuous address records. All of these people are going to really struggle to document continuous residence, depending on what the documentary requirements are. It also depends on whether people are required to show that they have been legally resident for a certain period of time, which depends on EU law, which means that people only had a legal status if they were in work, actively seeking work, or self-sufficient. So in some, it's kind of likely to be pretty easy for people who were registered with a municipality or were in work, but much harder for people who didn't register, whose work history is a little bit spotty. So what I say in the paper is that I think there's likely to be a sort of proliferation of people who are in a kind of legal no man's land for a number of reasons. First, because the deal will take time to implement. Second, because I think there's likely to be quite significant backlogs in processing. I mean, this is quite a large-scale exercise that most countries are not prepared for. And there's the issue of what happens to people whose claims are turned down and what appeal systems exist. If there's no deal, of course, countries will be faced with the challenge of deciding what to do unilaterally or bilaterally. But there's a really awkward time lag there where they'll have to wait right till the end the negotiations to see if there is a deal before they can start any of those processes. So yeah, I basically think that this kind of uncertainty and legal limbo is quite likely to continue for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Megan. I think that's really important to sort of outline the underlying issues that we may be looking at in the future. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to turn to Asya Kavlakova, who is the Director of the European Citizen Action Service, which is a non-profit organization with a pan-European membership looking at citizens' rights and civic participation in the EU decision-making process. So I imagine you've been quite busy over the last year, and you're going to outline a few findings from a recent survey that you've undertaken, Asya.
Yes, thank you so much. Just to add a bit to the complexity of the situation, the flavor of the opinion of the citizens themselves, we are very much of a citizen-centric organization, so therefore, of course, we cared about what people think and how they feel. So this was the reason why we launched a survey immediately after Ms. May triggered Article 50 on the 29th of March, asking citizens whether they feel personally concerned by Brexit and what exactly does that mean for them. So we actually collected responses for about 6 weeks. What we didn't really expect was the high level of interest in this survey, because actually we didn't make any specific efforts to distribute it. It was just available on our website. All of a sudden we noticed that it has been shared 66 times on our website, and believe me, till then no one has ever shared more than 3 times anything from our website. So this of course put us in a situation in which we had even to draw additional human resources in order to analyze the results. So you see the underlying response here is that 71% from the British citizens and 21% of the EU citizens responding to the survey, and 96% of the UK citizens feel personally affected by Brexit. The percentage for the EU citizens is also quite high. Here I would like just to make a couple of remarks about the social demographic profile of the respondents, because it is quite different. The predominant part of the UK citizens who responded, of course, for me, they're still EU citizens, for all of us. Here, just for the clarity and for the purpose of distinguishing them from the EU citizens residing in the UK, we call them UK citizens. So the predominant part of them actually live in the EU. And the top 3 countries who responded to our survey, the citizens there, were France, Belgium, Spain. The 4th place was occupied by the Netherlands. Also, the majority of the UK respondents were over 56 years of age. This is something which is quite different from the majority of EU respondents, who were younger, actually below 47 years of age. So I couldn't agree more with the previous speaker that actually we are witnessing the concerns of a very diverse group of UK citizens residing in the EU. As you see, even from this survey, about 1/3 of them are pensioners, but the majority of all the rest are either employed or self-employed. So let's see what exactly are their concerns. There is no doubt that for both groups, the most valued rights are European citizenship rights. Nevertheless, there are a slight difference in the responses of the UK citizens versus the EU ones. Definitely, the right to live in another EU country freely is the most valued right by the UK respondents, followed by the right to access public health care in another country, and then the 3rd place being occupied by the right to enter without a visa another EU country. So from that perspective, really freedom of movement in the EU itself is highly valued. The next slide will indicate to us the rights, the awareness level of the rights of the both groups. I mean, we have been asking these questions, and we have provided the respondents with the opportunity to define the level of the awareness of their rights. So from what we can see from here is that no matter what the initial level was, after the referendum and after the triggering of the Article 50, there have been a decrease by percentage points of the awareness of the rights of the citizens. This simply comes to show that actually people are very confused and very worried. They do not know what will happen to their future, neither do they know what to believe in anymore, which we will see from the next slide. Those are the top 5 concerns after Brexit for the 2 groups. And here we see that actually there is a difference. I mean, no matter that restrictions to the freedom of movement are top concern for both groups. Then the loss of the European citizenship, which is very much related with the feeling of loss of identity even, as well as the economic impact of the post-Brexit situation, worries UK citizens very much. Here, especially with regard to the third concern, I can say that most of them are worried that they would have to go back to the UK, and then they're not sure whether they will manage to cope economically with their new situation there. While for the EU citizens, the restrictions, of course, of the freedom of movement are a concern, but then the level of uncertainty about their future, whether they will be able to stay, and if yes, under what circumstances, also is an area of concern. And here we see something which we've been witnessing also through different examples, unfortunately, and this is the concern for unequal treatment and the fear of discrimination and xenophobia in the UK. There are some thoughts here that were shared with us through the open responses of the survey. I'm not going to read them because I suppose everyone can do so. There is one positive news to the extent that we can have positive news in these circumstances and in this framework, and it relates to the fact that actually what happened has provoked a high level of political activism, both among UK citizens as well as among EU citizens. So UK citizens have become more active in campaigns, they have joined political parties, and they started informing them better because they simply shared with us that they do not trust politicians anymore. And here are some of their thoughts as well. Thank you very much.
So it's very interesting to hear that, and particularly that UK citizens are relatively less concerned about their own uncertainty about the future, perhaps in part because the EU frameworks will still apply on the mainland Europe and not necessarily apply in the UK itself. We have around 20 minutes or so for questions, so I would ask anyone who's listening and who has a question for our panelists to use the question and answer function on your screen, to email events@migrationpolicy.org, or tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. However, I have oodles of questions. Being a UK national in the EU, I will try and make them general, however, rather than my personal status. I just want to start by asking Marie, I mean, you've been involved in the negotiations. They're obviously very intense and still working out the main principles. How far have you had discussions with the EU27 about how they will prepare the sort of paperwork and bureaucracy that will inevitably follow a deal when it comes to citizens' rights? Are there some countries where you think, will obviously have a greater pressure in terms of the administration that will be needed because they have a larger population? Is this something that's already coming up in discussions, or do you think this is going to be much later down the road?
Yes, so thanks for the question. It's a good question, and it's one that we have discussed in depth with the 27 member states. We meet them on a very regular basis to brief and debrief before and after each negotiating round. And we are basically, well, we are working on their mandate, so we don't do anything in these negotiations that they have not asked us to do. On the administrative procedures, this is basically a problem that is proper to the situation in the UK. The UK has chosen to establish a new status. It is their choice. It's not the choice of the EU27 member states. We asked them if they saw a need for changing their current administrative procedures because of this new situation. And they replied to us that this is not the case. They obviously are not going to ask suddenly 3 million citizens to register. Indeed, some of the member states could have certain regions who will, let's say, be subject to a big burden suddenly because of a higher number of applications than usual, but not at all in the same scale in the UK, where these 3 million applications, of course, is quite of an extraordinary burden on the public authorities. Yeah, the 27 member states have said that for them there no need to change their current procedures. However, they do see possibly a need to be able to identify who is covered by the withdrawal agreement and who is not.
Mm-hmm.
So my reply.
So there's a real need for data, and not just data at the national level, but in terms of locality, because in many countries, the sorts of residence rights are given at the subnational level. I mean, you know, Alex, to sort of take a question from the audience, is the question of citizens' rights one that is likely to break the unity, the current unity we see with the EU 27? Are they likely to start negotiating directly if they don't see a deal and they have concerns, whether about their own citizens or whether about how to manage future residency?
Will it break the unity of the 27? On its own, I doubt it. Will the aftermath of a no deal force member states to discuss arrangements with the UK separately, particularly those member states that have, you know, a deep interest in that? Quite possibly. I'm not sure that will feed into the negotiation as much, because I suspect even in the worst case no deal scenario, it's very hard to imagine the UK being in a political situation where it would basically say the 3 million in the UK have no rights, or will be expelled, or would after a certain cutoff point no longer enjoy the rights they have. I think that's pretty hard to imagine, not least because there's logistically not the ability to enforce anything like that, even if there was the political will. So a lot of the worst effects of a no-deal scenario, I suspect, would be managed at national level in the UK and within the 27, but obviously it will be very messy, and I suspect those kind of discussions about future social security coordination and things like that would eventually start up with member states.
Thanks, Alex. And I've heard some in the UK sort of say blithely, well, it doesn't really matter. Everyone can just get citizenship, whether UK citizenship or citizenship of another EU country. And Megan, do you see any challenges in terms of people acquiring dual citizenship in the sense of gaining themselves an insurance policy? Is that an opportunity? Are we seeing citizenship trends change already because of the precarity of these discussions?
Yeah, so we do look at this in the paper. It's difficult, again, to get kind of comparative data for the whole EU 27 on citizenship rates, but we can see a bit of an uptick in certain countries. So in Sweden in 2016, 960 UK nationals became citizens. That's compared to 444 in 2015, so almost doubling, but it's still really modest rates compared to, for instance, citizenship acquisition of other EU countries like Polish and Germans, for instance, which are kind of close to the thousands. German citizenship is a bit higher, so it increased to nearly 3,000 in 2016. And I think it will be interesting next year to see if we see an even greater spike. But one issue that is really coming up from people we speak to is the question of dual citizenship. So in several countries in the EU, like the Netherlands and Spain, you can't have dual citizenship if what if your other citizenship is not in the EU? And this is confronting certain kind of mixed families, you know, who have a Dutch parent and a British parent with quite significant questions for their children. You know, do they want to have the secure citizenship status in the country where they currently live, or do they want to be able to travel freely to the UK and study there in the future? And so this is really coming up as one of the really big concerns in places like the Netherlands. But then I think the question of citizenship acquisition does raise a broader point, which kind of connects to the stuff that I was trying to say earlier about who will be vulnerable. Those who have the resources, the family lineage, the ability to become citizens of another EU country, whether or not they currently live there, will do so. Whereas those who, you know, are unable to secure their status will be really vulnerable. And I think we're going to see this sort of split into this kind of people with the super status who retain their EU citizenship rights and can still move everywhere, and people, you know, who struggle even to get their status in the country where they currently live regularized. So yeah, I think that's an implication that we haven't really thought about when it comes to the sort of symbolism of Brexit and what that means for membership and belonging. You know, we're all losing, our British citizenship is all becoming kind of devalued, but lots of people are going to be able to nonetheless flourish by getting citizenship of elsewhere.
Thanks, Megan. Well, actually, you've looked at the issues of citizens' rights and citizenship, and we've had a question from our audience, which is really digging into your survey. How many people was your survey based on, and how did you find them? Sort of, how did you build up your survey respondents?
It was available online, and we received 1,670 unique responses. We didn't do actually any special efforts in promoting it. So, but of course, I mean, we did so through our network. We have quite a lot of associations that are dealing with citizens' rights. So we use them in order to raise awareness that such an opportunity for sharing concerns exists. But rather than that, no special efforts. I would like to add something to the previous speakers. Because we have a network of legal experts who actually provide advice to citizens who exercise their right to free movement across borders, and there have been some tendencies here in the last half a year, let's say, which show quite an interesting and unfortunate for British citizens practice in some member states. There are a couple of countries which systematically refuse to issue long-term residence cards to British citizens who have resided legally on their territory for more than 5 years. Just saying that, you know, you are living anyway, so you wouldn't need it. So here's the question of the response of the EU27 actually to the outcome of the negotiations is important, because there is another layer beyond, which goes beyond the official positions of the member states, and this is what the administration does on the ground, and the trends are worrying, I would say.
Yeah, and I think there's enormous variance in capacity across the EU member states, the ability to from processing residence permits to realising rights, which I know your organisation has spent so much time thinking about. I mean, that links into a question we've had from the audience, which is sort of, Marie and perhaps Megan, you can also chime in. Could you set out how far you think you would have competence to sort of manage the migration of UK nationals post-Brexit? You know, once a deal has been set out, are you then just reliant on the existing EU frameworks to think about EU national mobility within the EU? Do they just become third country nationals in effect? Or are you thinking about a kind of a status where you are trying to sort of influence the way UK nationals are treated in continental Europe?
So what you're asking about is concerning the future relations we will have, or hopefully have, with the UK. We're simply not discussing these issues with the UK until we have achieved sufficient progress on our 3 priority files, which are citizens, Ireland, and the financial settlement, as Alex also mentioned at the beginning. So we're not getting into these discussions at all with the UK side at this stage. But obviously, whatever will come in a possible free trade agreement would have to be reciprocal. But we will see. I mean, as a matter of fact, UK nationals will be third country. We will all be third country nationals in our relations with each other, and the UK will be a third country. So much I can say with certainty. But for the rest, we will have to see when we can start discussing the future relations.
Yeah, just to chip in. So as Marie says, the question of future flows is really in the for discussion later bucket. But one thing that's quite interesting is this question of whether current UK nationals in the EU will become third country nationals. As Marie said, they kind of do by default. But one problem that we look at in the report is if there is no deal and then all of these UK citizens are essentially relying on other EU law which protects third country nationals, would that framework work for them? And it's sort of difficult to see how it would, because all of the way that the directives are framed, so for instance, I'm thinking of the Permanent Residency Directive, which gives third country nationals who've lived in the country for 5 years an entitlement to permanent residence. They're not written for people who moved exercising their free movement rights. So UK nationals sort of don't really fit into that third country national framework. So it's quite possible, if there wasn't a deal, that countries would start creating a different status, or the European courts would have to think about a former EU national status. So they wouldn't necessarily be just third country nationals, and I think that some of those legal intricacies, particularly if there isn't a deal, haven't yet been addressed.
Thanks, Megan. I think that's a particularly important point, that there is a certain no man's land that people might find themselves in, and that being able to document your residence in a particular area may become more important than previously, just as it has become more important, I think, for a lot of EU nationals in the UK. Just to reiterate, we've got about 10 minutes left, and if anyone has any questions, please send them via Twitter, via events@migrationpolicy, or using the very exciting Q&A function that we have. We do have a question that's slightly sort of off topic and going back to the situation of EU nationals in the UK, and perhaps Alex and Asra, these are questions for you, which is really generally, how will workers from Central and Eastern Europe in the UK be affected after Brexit? Will they be more precarious? What will the labour market opportunities look like? If you have any thoughts on how that particular block might be affected, given that they have been a larger proportion in recent years of free movers.
Can I answer? If you're talking about those who are already in the UK at the moment, I think in practice, there probably isn't that much of a difference on the day after Brexit in terms of where they can work, who they're working for, the kind of rights they would have in the UK. I think clearly there would be an administrative burden in terms of ensuring those are kind of guaranteed on paper, and how kind of difficult a process that is. We're to see, as the UK lays out its kind of approach to this. For those who arrive afterwards, it will be probably a different context. And while in the transition, it's pretty clear that there would be free movement. In effective terms, someone would be able to move from, Slovakia or Germany to the UK, seek employment, and not be hindered in that. the question of whether they could stay beyond the transition and have the kind of confidence that they would be able to stay for that kind of 5-year period or longer is more open. It's a more open question, and there will be a cut-off date when that transition ends and a new regime comes in. And while I think it won't be as kind of clear-cutter kind of endpoint for most people, it will the systems will kind of bleed into each other to some degree. The security that you'd have as a new worker exercising free movement rights in that transition period is clearly much less.
Thanks.
If I can share a very quick thought on that, I think the problem with this concept which now the UK is putting forward about the acquired status of the EU citizens there is that it can work provided that the EU citizens that are residing in the UK now do not plan to move ever after. Because unlike the freedom of movement right, which allows you to move from one country to another, then to return and to actually have your status of a European citizen, if you acquire the right in the UK and then you move to another country and spend there more than 3 years, and they decide to go back to the UK, you will be treated like a third country national.
Mm-hmm.
So this for us, from a legal point of view, is very, very tricky. And I'm not sure to what extent actually the EU citizens living in the UK can realize that.
Yeah, I think it's a broader phenomenon we see in migration, which is the greater legal flexibility you have, the more mobility you actually give people. And I think that also applies for UK nationals living on mainland Europe. The question of whether they move to another EU member state is suddenly a much more important one if they lose their existing rights in the country they're in. I want to ask a final question. And I'm going to ask it to all of the panelists in turn, which is, given the challenges and the complications and the fact that there are asymmetries in access to a lot of this information, should there be a Brexit rights advice line? And if so, who should be managing it and giving out the information? Should it be the UK government? Should it be the EU? Or should it be someone independent? Azra, if we could start with you and then go to Megan, Alex, and finally Marie.
Well, what I really think is that this could be very helpful. We actually receive a lot of questions concerning Brexit, but it could be very helpful once we know what the agreement would be. Because at this very point, everything that we can say is simply based on speculations or forecasts. So this is the difficulty at the moment. I mean, whether there is a line or not, the question is, what do you say to people?
So there should be an advice line when we have some advice to give. Megan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I almost completely agree. I think one of the challenges for a lot of UK nationals on the continent is that they don't know who to go to ask for advice, and different institutions are kind of playing that role in different countries. So in some places you have kind of local citizens advice centres, you're fielding a lot of calls. In some countries the embassies have been taking a bit more of a lead. But that challenge that Asia points to, how do you give advice in a context of extreme uncertainty, is very difficult even currently for people who are in that position, and you can't really solve that until there's been greater progress on a deal, I think.
Come the Brexit agony aunt and have a page on the FT.
I think when the moment is ripe in terms of the clarity of the deal, I think, yes, absolutely there should be. Even more important, I think, is going to be how both the UK and the EU kind of oversee the use of discretion by bureaucracies, administrations in enforcing this deal, and to make sure that individuals who have rights under the deal are properly able to exercise them and aren't just caught up in a kind of maze of bureaucracy. And I think that applies at 27 level certainly as much as it does at the UK, although their administrative challenge is greater. And whether you can do that at a more central kind of specific, with a central organization and purpose, I don't know, but it may well be needed, because I suspect, this is going to be applied in very different ways in different member states.
I mean, Marie, this is enforcement of EU rules on migration, on free movement, has always been sticky, and there's always been a huge divergence in terms of implementation. Is there a centralized role for the European Commission here in both providing advice to citizens, but also dealing with the discretion issue that Alex has raised?
Yes. So, well, we can say for sure that until we have a final deal, it is impossible to give clear advice to citizens about their rights. However, I think that when we reach a stage of sufficient progress, there will be a clear indication on the points on which both sides agree, and that will give a very strong indication of the rights that citizens will enjoy under the withdrawal agreement. And again, I think that both sides, both the EU and UK, we are actually, it's an easy file in the sense that both sides are actually interested in protecting citizens' rights on both sides of the channel, which is very much different from, for example, the other priority file on the financial settlement. So we have a common interest here. Then secondly, in the directive that we want to grandfather, the Free Movement Directive, there's already a provision on publicity that we should also grandfather, that the member states, so the UK and the EU27, have to make sure that the citizens get the necessary information in order to being able to exercise their rights. And finally, on Alex's point on bureaucracy and the risks on the administrative procedures, so these risks, let's say these problems are already existing, and this is why direct effect in the UK of the withdrawal agreement is so important for us, because we think that if there is no such direct effect, indeed the citizens could be lost somewhere without being able to really enforce their rights based on the agreement. Of course, for UK nationals in the EU will not have the same problem, because there will be direct effect and the full authority of the European Court of Justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a question not just of establishing the rights and giving advice, but actually outreach to those individuals that might find themselves in a more vulnerable position. So this is a conversation that will keep going over the next couple of years. I would like to thank all of our panelists very much for their time this afternoon and their thoughtful interventions. I think we got to almost all of the questions. But thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon from the audience. And I encourage you all to read Megan's excellent paper, Safe or Sorry. And the audio from today's webinar will be available at migrationpolicy.org/events. If there's any need for reporters on the call who would like more information, you can email Michelle Mittelstadt at communications@migrationpolicy.org. And this is part of an ongoing project being undertaken by MPI Europe on UK nationals in the EU, informally entitled Brexit, and supported by the Barry Cadbury Trust. So we will continue talking about these issues, and I hope to welcome us back at a future time to have a more in-depth discussion as our research continues, and wishing everyone a very enjoyable rest of the day. Thank you very much.